How is it going? I hope you're doing well. Today we're going to be talking about the GAS principle and actually why it's so important for instructors and coaches to actually understand what it is, actually know how to actually use it properly to elicit proper, effective adaptations. Now, it's really important that we understand that as instructors and coaches, because it means that we can actually manage fatigue properly and that we can actually manage training sessions in a way in which we can see adaptations actually occur, and actually how we make progressive linear progress to be able to see that progress actually happen with our athletes towards their goals. Now, the GAS principle, in short, is the General Adaptation Syndrome, and the GAS principle is what I'll refer to it as from now on. Now, the GAS principle was theorized or conceptualized by a psychologist, by the name of Hans Selye. Now, Hans Selye is what we refer to as the grandfather of stress, and he basically done so much work on how stress impacts us and how our bodies actually use stress to make different adaptations occur. Now, if you look at the diagram that's on the screen, that'll actually go through all the different phases of the GAS principle. Now, you'll see things like the alarm phase and stimulus phase and whatever else, okay? You don't need to really take on board that, because that makes it a little bit more complex, because there's a lot more going on in those phases, which for an instructor or a coach, whilst it is important for them to understand that, the overall message of what the GAS principle is gets lost in that a little bit if they can't break it down to the very simple steps. Okay, so essentially what we're looking at is baseline, and we'll use baseline throughout the entire explanation, because it's really important that we actually understand that that baseline is there for a reason and how we actually make adaptations occur. Now, Hans Selye essentially looked at stress, and more particular, it's more about resistance training stress on the muscles. Now, for us to actually make adaptations, we obviously need to train, but we have to train effectively, and that's where the optimal training stimulus comes in. Now, that can't just be doing a few push-ups, let's say, or a few sit-ups, whatever. You know, it has to be proper training. Now, things like 3 sets of 8 to 12 reps at 60 to 80% of your 1 rep max would elicit those optimal training stimulus, and it would then lead to adaptations occurring. For the GAS principle, you start at baseline, you go into that session, and what should happen is that optimal training stimulus occurs, you're training properly, and you should then feel fatigue set in. Over time, you should feel a little bit lethargic, you should see a little bit of energy loss from that for a short period of time. That's temporary, it's not a permanent thing. Now, with that optimal training stimulus out the way, what should happen is we should have that little bit of a trough that you can see in the diagram. That's our peak fatigue, let's say, after that session. Once we hit that little point, we'll then begin to recover as soon as that training session is finished, and that'll gradually go back up to baseline. Now, the GAS principle emphasizes rest and recovery. You need rest and recovery. Okay, it's not just as simple as, okay, I'm going to train every day, and as long as I get 6 to 8 hours of sleep, I'll be fine. It's not as simple as that. You need to have multiple days of recovery in between sessions to make sure that you allow adaptations to occur. I'll get on to why. Now, when you recover, you'll recover to baseline, and then if you give yourself enough time, you should then recover into a supercompensation phase. Now, the supercompensation phase is a short period of time following the training session and following the initial recovery, where you'll actually see slight gains or those adaptations occurring. Now, that can be seen in different ways. So that could be an extra rep on an exercise, that could be increased weight, it might be being able to sustain an increased time under tension, let's say, more comfortably, okay? Or it might be, you might be able to complete a repetition quicker for a certain weight, okay? Once you hit that supercompensation phase, what will happen is you should train within that phase, and that'll then become your new baseline. And essentially what we should be doing is we'll train, we'll get fatigued, we'll recover, enter that supercompensation phase, and then train again. And that kind of process occurs consistently, and with that consistent nature, you should see gradual progressive progression actually happening. And that's why progressive overload is really important, to be able to make sure that we maintain not only our baseline fitness, but we also are pushing the body beyond its limit slightly, not excessively, but there should be a slight increase gradually as you go. So that means that you should progressively have a supercompensation which gradually increases session by session or week by week, depending on how kind of trained you are. Whether you're a beginner, you might see that week on week. For a more advanced person, you might see it every couple of weeks. Okay, it just depends on the level of fitness that you're at, and also what training adaptations you've already gone through. You need to balance it with the fit principles from making sure that you're not training too frequently. Make sure that you're balancing intensity with volume, whether you're actually balancing the type of training that you're doing, so it's not overloading the same type of training consistently, because that's not going to have the best effect long term. And then also making sure that you're not training for way too long. Hopefully that was informative, and that actually allows you to take that on board and use that in your own practice to make sure that your athletes or participants are actually developing properly, and that you're actually giving them enough recovery time based on how intense or how much volume they're doing, and also making sure that you're hitting that supercompensation phase properly to make linear progression occur. If you want to see more science-based tips and more explanations on different principles or different concepts that are a little bit hard to get your head around, then keep coming back, because I'll be doing things like periodization and how different methods of periodization are used and why, and what the benefits are and what the limitations are, those types of things. And then also a few other bits on proper training methods and why they're effectively used in training different types of athletes and why they're important for them. So if you do want to come back, like, subscribe, comment,